It's Monday, June 23rd at Portland. Herb Maybank speaking for the Historical Committee, and I'm interviewing George Menzies of Hamilton, Ontario, who has just retired from ASHRAE Research Canada. After many years of involvement, and I'm now going to ask George to speak extemporaneously off the cuff to describe how he got involved in ASHRAE Research Canada and what has transpired since he did, in his own words.
Thank you very much, Herb. It's a pleasure to be in a position at this time to discuss ASHRAE Research Canada, something that's been near to my heart since its incorporation, even prior to that, and being involved in it for 15 years. Just to review, back in 1971, I was a delegate to the CRC in Quebec City, at which time Hay Murray was the Vice Chairman of Research Promotion for Region 2. And at that CRC, we realized that Canadian members, Canadian industry and businesses did not have the same benefits as Americans, in that investments in ASHRAE or in research, ASHRAE research, were not deductible on their tax returns. And because we did not have that benefit, very few funds were being raised in Canada. In fact, during the course of 1971, less than $300 was raised in Canada. So we challenged Hay Murray at that time that the only way we would be able to get deeply involved in a fundraising campaign throughout Canada is to have that deductibility status. So Hay took that idea, and with John Fox and Jake Clausen, the three of them got their heads together, and Hay then spearheaded a campaign through our Montreal, ASHRAE Montreal lawyers, and created and incorporated a company, or at least a corporation, called ASHRAE Research Canada. It was incorporated in Quebec on June the 8th, 1972. That incorporation then allowed contributions or investments in research in Canada to become deductible for those individuals carrying on business in Canada. With that, in 1973, in the period 72-73 fiscal year, we then raised $20,000. We went from a few hundred to $20,000. So obviously, this was a vehicle which was going to work. Since that period of 72 and 73, the first year, we have now raised something in the order of between $50,000 and $60,000 a year for investment in research in Canada. Now the key is that it's got to be spent in Canada. You raise the money in Canada, you spend it in Canada. And over the period since incorporation, we have now spent close to $600,000 in Canada on research, on ASHRAE research. We've had research at universities from the East and the West, from Edmonton, the University of Alberta, University of Alberta. We've had McMaster University in Hamilton, Concordia in Montreal, University of BC, University of Manitoba. There are some major projects there. University of New Brunswick, University of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, University of Western Ontario, and University of Windsor. So we've had research virtually throughout Canada in that period of the last 15 years. In that same period, we have raised just short of $600,000 for this investment in Canada. So we've actually never caught up to the amount being spent. So virtually every dollar that's collected in Canada is spent in Canada. And that's important for the members to know. During this period, from 72 for the first 3 years, Hay Murray was president of the corporation. He was followed by Bev Neal of the next few years, then followed by a very familiar Canadian member, John Ross, And then in 1981, John Ross retired and I took over, and I've been the president for the last 5 years until the annual meeting in May of this year at Niagara Falls, when Dennis Kisselback from Vancouver, British Columbia took over as president. It's interesting, in those 15 years, I was involved as the delegate to the CRC, challenging the system. Less than a year later, it was incorporated. In those next 3 years, I was vice chairman of research promotion for Region 2, and at that time that was virtually all of Canada except BC. So I was involved in the fundraising then under Hay Murray for those next 3 years. Then I was followed that followed when I became regional chairman for Region 2.
Was Hay Murray the regional chairman while you were vice chairman of research promotion?
No,
He stayed head of Research Canada.
he was
Yes.
president for the first 3 years. He was president of ASHRAE Research Canada. So he was the inaugural president and held that capacity for 3 years. And under him, I was the vice chairman, raising money. And then in that period, we raised our first almost $100,000 in those first 3 years. So we knew we were on the right track. And then I followed that, being a regional chairman for Region 2, of which I then had Al Oakes and Paul Conrad under my wing as vice chairman, who also were involved. All three of us were involved in, again, under Bev Neal as president of ARC, working, trying to raise funds. So I, again, was involved in the fundraising aspect. Equally, at the chapter level, I was involved as a fundraiser, president of, or at least chairman of the Research Promotion Committee for the chapter at the Hamilton chapter. And I've been on that committee ever since 1972. Then, when John Ross took over, I became involved in ASHRAE Research Promotion and ASHRAE Research Canada, principally as a fundraiser in Canada. And in '81, I was elected as the president of ARC, and for the past 5 years been involved in that. It's been an interesting period of 5 years because we've looked very hard at the fact that we were a parallel organization to ASHRAE. We were incorporated, and we were a separate corporation called ASHRAE Research Canada, of which ASHRAE is also incorporated. So we really have two companies working, or two corporations working side by side. And there was a question that were we really going to become totally independent and become a Canadian arm of ASHRAE? Well, it was never intended. When Hay Murray incorporated, we were intended strictly to be a paper corporation to give members, better cut it.
Carry on.
We were intended strictly to be a corporation to be the vehicle to give the contributions a deductibility status. But in the last 5 years, because of the new regional setup, the new council setup, the society has grown immensely, and the question really came forth. ARC could hardly be just a small corporation. It had to be a spokesman for Canadian members. So instead, we reviewed whether we would continue it at all, whether it became just an arm of ASHRAE that wasn't needed, because as ASHRAE moves into international flavor, Hong Kong and the United Arab, should we have that kind of an incorporation in each of these countries? And would we have a proliferation of these incorporations or corporations all over? Well, it has worked out that after careful thought, we do need to stay, but we need to have an affiliation agreement with ASHRAE. And at the annual meeting in May of 1986, we passed, at the annual meeting, the members in Canada passed an affiliation agreement so that we are directly tied to the society, and that we really cannot operate totally independent, that we are tied to all the rules and organization that ASHRAE represents, and that we will be part of ASHRAE and will not be able to become an independent Canadian organization. So it's been an interesting 5 years for me, because we've gone from being, when John Ross turned it over and I succeeded him, we were very organized from a political point of view in Canada, and we've gone through these strains of 5 years of looking at ourselves and saying, do we really need to exist, to the point where, yes, we do represent a unique feature for Canadian ASHRAE members that we don't want to give up. We really want that. However, we do need some constraints, and we have had this affiliation agreement to be tied to the society so that we can't become totally independent, which really our letters of patent that were used for incorporation gave us that independence, because the letters of patent were exactly the same letters of patent the society was formed, except they were out of New York and we were out of Montreal. So anyway, it's been an interesting 15 years. I'm going to miss the action, because you get involved in both the awarding of contracts, of the research contracts in Canada, reviewing the various potential projects that will come forth out of Canada, the bidding list, right through to the fundraising, getting involved at the chapter level, coast to coast. Because of the new regional setup, we just operated throughout Region 11 and Region 2. And if the proposed realignment, where we have, in theory, 4 regions of which Canadian chapters might be present, again, it gives you that Canadian flavor, regardless of the chapter and regional setup. So it's been a very exciting, and for me, a very personally rewarding 15 years, when I've got to meet so many good people coast to coast. So it is with a lot of regret that I'm going to miss this operation, although I don't think I'll always be involved, certainly at the chapter level, and no doubt in other
ASHRAE
levels.
Research Canada, from what you're saying, that I would understand that ASHRAE Research Canada does provide that tie that we feel we need in Canadian chapters, so there is a common thread running through them.
Perfect. That's exactly well said, and that's the fact of life. Government affairs, there's other committees and subcommittees that have not been able to bring out that thread that you described, and ARC has that, and it's amazing the common bond we have, chapter and cities throughout the country, and the membership, the ASHRAE membership, and how we can utilize ARC as that vehicle to give that bond that I'm sure we're going to need, not only now, but if we have this new setup in the future, it'll become even more important.
You mean where they have more a north-south orientation between chapters in the strung-out Canadian, along the Canadian border, being connected with chapters closer in a north-south direction in the States?
I wouldn't say a north-south, trying to group chapters geographically regardless of the borders.
Yes.
So that the regional chairman can operate more effectively within that geographical area.
So ASHRAE Research Canada can maintain that Canadian thread, as we speak
Yes.
of, the tie between our Canadian chapters, so they don't get totally separated.
Right.
I see.
And there's just, with ASHRAE and research, that is what ASHRAE is all about, is developing new concepts and ideas and standards, and it just ends up that because of ARC, we'll always have a Canadian flavor.
Looking at the historical concept of ASHRAE Research Canada, nothing really happened in research promotion fundraising in Canada because individuals and businesses, I'm speaking of self-employed individuals and businesses, could not use the contributions prior to that time until there was a tax arrangement made with the government that this money was going into a Canadian corporation for research only. That really was the start of the significant increase. We pretty well covered the historical from back there. How about some comments from you as to what you see in the coming years, thoughts or recommendations as to our future course of action?
In the future years, as I see it right now, I don't expect a major change in the philosophy of the corporation. Hopefully, the Canadian universities and institutions will be interested in bidding on ASHRAE research. From the current list, we have probably in excess of 200 projects that need to be underwritten in the next few years. All of those 200 projects are available to be bid on by the Canadian institutions, such as the universities and other operations.
Such as Ontario Hydro, who have had some, Meyer Perlman has had some, a $31,000 grant from ASHRAE Research, I believe, for work he did.
Yes. So we have many projects that need to be underwritten. We have in excess of 30 bidders from Canada, invited bidders to bid on those projects as they come. As the prioritizing takes place, they have an opportunity to bid on those. And so I feel that there will be a continual need for research to be done in Canada. Certainly we are favored with a dollar situation right now where we can bid against the Americans and providing the equipment's available and so on. And we do have a good bid. You'll see the research coming north. With the research coming north, it is to our benefit to underwrite a lot of that research with money out of Canada. Although it appears that we will likely see our expenses in Canada on these projects still exceed our contributions. I don't think we'll ever see it the other way, but it could happen. And the incorporation requires us to spend 90% of what is raised in Canada. Well, that's never been very difficult to meet. So we do spend generally more in any year in Canada than we do raise. So I visualize in the next 10 years or beyond that, not a real significant change in our pattern since '72. And as you've mentioned, prior to '72, we just did not succeed in raising funds. The Americans at that time had raised in excess of 100,000, and we were like in a few $100. So obviously there needed to be a change. They're now reviewing the overseas and the international aspect. How can we get the other countries involved? And I believe, well, I know in the last 18 months there has been a project underwritten in a foreign country, I believe either in England, somewhere in the British Isles. So there is now projects being underwritten by ASHRAE as a society in other parts of the world. So we will get involvement with international members in underwriting those projects. But certainly for Canadians, ARC is, well, I don't like to say it's a necessary evil, but it has certainly created the vehicle necessary to get Canadian participation, and it's had that side benefit of tying all the Canadian chapters together. So it has really been to the benefit of the chapters to have this incorporation back
and to the benefit of ASHRAE overall.
Right. So it has worked out to be one of the most, to me, one of the most unique experiences to see an incorporation of in theory, call it a paper corporation, and yet it has worked out to be one of the strongest vehicles for Canadian ASHRAE members to have a Canadian flavor and a Canadian reason to be part of ASHRAE, and to see these projects underway in Canada and get involved in the people involved in those projects. It's been exciting. Our TCs have benefited, our technical committees. It's been a real benefit to the society.
George, thank you very much for your comments. I think we've pretty well covered it, and certainly look forward to your continued participation, because you're still too young to give it up altogether. One comment I'd like to make, and that is, it seems to me that the efforts at the chapter level in looking at the monies raised by the various chapters, some chapters have the methods together for doing a good job, and some chapters do not. And it would seem to me that this is an area that ASHRAE members and those interested in ASHRAE Research Canada are going to have to work on.
Herb, you're right. That it is both gratifying and at the same time you see sadness in the chapter performance coast to coast. Small chapters like Regina with their couple of dozen active members raising thousands every year early and successfully and no pattern, no significant change year to year. They get their thousands raised. Larger chapters, BC, Montreal, Toronto, have had difficulties. Year to year, the pattern is unbelievably different. One year they raise 10, 20,000. Other years they raise 2 to 3. You can't explain it other than within the chapter, the operation is just not organized or it isn't effective. And it's very likely that the committee is not large enough to handle the needs of a large chapter. 2 or 3 individuals in that chapter attempt to run the campaign on their own with dedication and a lot of hours. They work at it, but they just don't have the team necessary to cover the numbers of businesses that are within that area. And that is the topic that will certainly have to be addressed in the next few years. That is the performance level in the large chapters. And that's not unlike the situation in the States. New York is the principal, one of the principal chapters that has had difficulties. And many other, I shouldn't single out New York, but many chapters, large chapters in the States have had the same problem. They just can't put it together and have it work effectively. Whereas you get a small chapter like Regina.
Or Austin, Texas, where the chap won the award today.
Good.
Went from 4,000 to 6,000 to 12,000 this last year.
So we know that the smaller the chapter, that seems to be the more effective, but I'm sure it's the fact that they get the whole chapter involved. In a large chapter, how do you get everybody involved? And yet that's what's needed. If ASHRAE is going to progress in the future, we need involvement not only by all the members, but all the businesses that are benefiting from the research.
Okay, thank you very much.
Created to explain ASHRAE research.
They're separate leaflets, ASHRAE Research Canada leaflets.
Yep. They're exclusive to us. One is describes how we got incorporated and how we fit in. I don't think I put any dates. I made this such that the dates, this was a generic pamphlet. The other one, which is updated every couple of years, is the summary of funds spent. And I don't think McMaster's, oh yeah, the Hydro one. Yeah, McMaster and the Hydro one did get in here. The latest McMaster one is not in here. The $90,000 one is not in here. But they were created just to help explain to the members in Canada, and again, that took 10 years of experimenting with different forms and everything else to try to summarize it. And they really are the two things that I would think would be useful for you historically.
Thank you, George. Menzies. It's Monday, June